The senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, 16 years after the Supreme Court's disastrous Citizens United decision, families across Arizona are paying more for groceries, rent, gas, and health care. And they're wondering why the people they elect to represent them always seem to have time for the priorities of billionaires and big corporations, but not enough time for them. That question did not come out of nowhere. It came from lived experience. Hard-working Americans are doing everything right. They're working longer hours. They're budgeting carefully. They're raising their families, and they're just trying to stay afloat. But they're still falling behind. And that's why we're here today. In 2010, the Supreme Court handed down a decision that put a for sale sign on our democracy. The Citizens United ruling opened the door for corporations and billionaires to spend unlimited amounts of money to influence our elections, often without the public ever knowing who's behind it. The court decided that spending money in elections is the same thing as political speech, and that corporations should have the same political rights as individual Americans. Does that make any sense? And the results of this was somewhat predictable. And it wasn't limited to a courtroom. It changed how this place, the United States Senate, works. The loudest voices in Washington became billionaires and not everyday Americans. It led to the rise of super PACs and dark money groups. These groups, they come out of nowhere, and they spend millions and millions of dollars attacking one candidate or cause or supporting another. They organize around what benefits them financially, and they pour massive amounts of money into securing a specific outcome that benefits them. And they aren't subject to the same transparency or accountability of a campaign that a candidate runs. It created a system where power shifts away from everyday Americans and towards the people who can write the big, giant checks. That shows up in the policies that politicians fight for and the ones that they block. It's no surprise. And right now, under Donald Trump and Republicans in Washington, we're seeing this dynamic play out very clearly. Last year, Republicans passed a bill to hand out massive tax breaks to billionaires and giant corporations, paid for by throwing 300,000 Arizonans off of their health care and slashing food assistance for families who need it. He has stacked his cabinet with billionaire friends who are completely out of touch with everyday working Americans who are often living paycheck to paycheck. And early in his term, he tapped an unqualified person, Elon Musk, the wealthiest man in the world, who spent more money than anybody else to get Donald Trump elected, hired him to oversee an effort to recklessly fire thousands of hardworking federal employees and shut down entire agencies, undermining our national security. Americans are living through a serious cost of living crisis right now. Families are struggling with rising expenses for health care, for housing, for utilities, for groceries, just about everything. And what I hear from my constituents, they want relief. They want their government to help bring down costs and help make their lives more affordable. But time and again, the policies that would do exactly that stall, or they just die right here in this chamber and down the road at the White House. 16 years after Citizens United, this is not about relitigating a court case. It's about recognizing how deeply money in politics affects people's lives, and about drawing a clear line between a political system that serves billionaires and one that serves people. Americans see this clearly. They're demanding transparency. They're demanding accountability. And they're demanding a government that answers to the voters, not to the billionaires and not to the special interests. That's why from day one, I've approached this job differently. I've never taken a dime of corporate PAC money, and I never will. And I've introduced legislation to ban corporate PACs. I publish my schedule online so that everybody can see what I'm working on, who I'm meeting with, and how I am spending my time in this job. And I've introduced legislation to require all senators to do the same exact thing. I've also led on legislation to ban members of Congress from trading stocks. Let me be clear. Nobody should be able to use this job to profit personally. It's horrendous, and it's a huge problem. One of the first things I did after being elected was moving all of my assets and that of my wife's, Gabby Giffords, to a qualified blind trust, the best standard identified by Senate ethics. And I think all members of Congress need to do that. These are not radical ideas. They're about restoring trust and making sure that this place works for people who don't have lobbyists, who don't have super PACs, who can't write a 7-figure check. These shouldn't be radical demands. They're basic expectations. And here's why this matters so much right now. As long as big money and billionaires dominate our politics, it will continue to block progress on the issues that people care about most. Lowering skyrocketing healthcare costs, making housing more affordable, increasing competition so families aren't left paying more every single month. Those fights all run straight through the influence of corporate money. It is very clear. So let me be clear. Money is not speech. I mean, who came up with that? And corporations are not people. So this moment isn't just about looking backward at a court decision. That's not what we're getting at. It's about deciding what kind of Congress we want to be moving forward. Do we accept a system where access is bought and outcomes are shaped by the wealthiest members in our society? Or do we set a higher bar and say that democracy should work for the people who vote, not the people who spend millions of dollars of their own money in elections? That's the choice right in front of us. Now, I'm proud to be joined by my colleagues today as we mark 16 years since the Citizens United ruling, to make clear that the damage from that decision is real, and it's ongoing, and it's standing in the way of progress on the issues that people care most about. And this conversation This should not end here. It should continue with action, with accountability, and with a commitment to put people back at the center of our democracy. Thank you, Mr. President. And with that, I want to welcome my good friend and colleague, the senator from Rhode Island, Sheldon Whitehouse.
Mr. President.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Let me first thank Senator Kelly for coordinating this unfortunate commemoration of a truly disgraceful decision by the Republican appointees of the Supreme Court 16 years ago. This decision opened the floodgates of our politics to billions and billions of dollars in dark money. And those billions and billions in dark money have distorted our political process in ways that are obvious and evident to everybody who works in this building. Some are winners from that dark money spending, some are losers from that dark money spending, but everybody sees it. Billionaire spending in our elections is up 160 times. 160 times more billionaire spending in our elections now that billionaires can pump money in by the millions. Just 100 families poured a record-breaking $2.6 billion into federal elections in 2024. I don't know how democracy survives in an environment in which 100 super wealthy families are dumping $2.6 billion in special interest spending, influence spending, into our elections. This is not a hypothetical problem. I care a lot about climate change, and I see what is happening to our coasts, particularly in Rhode Island, and I was here before the Citizens United decision, when robust, meaningful, bipartisan climate legislation was constant here in the Senate. I can think of 4 major bipartisan bills here in the Senate, and I remember my friend John McCain running for president, carrying the Republican banner into that presidential election with a completely solid and respectable climate platform. Well, right after Citizens United, all of that stopped. The barrage of fossil fuel dark money into our politics killed bipartisanship on climate change instantly. It is still a problem today. Just yesterday, I asked to move a resolution that declared that climate change is not a hoax, that climate science is sound science, and that research into the effects of climate change should continue, and Republicans objected to that simple resolution. The fossil fuel industry bought this obstruction of climate legislation for 16 years now with money. They poured $450 million into political influence spending during the 2024 cycle, and that's only the identifiable money. Then there's the dark money, and we don't know how big that number was. We're already seeing the climate problem cascade into a homeowner's insurance crisis, cascade into a crisis of mortgage unavailability, and ultimately home value losses. It's already happening in Florida, for instance. So this is real, with real consequences for regular Americans. There was a big flaw in the Citizens United decision. The Citizens United decision hung on 2 assertions of fact by that slim Republican majority that warped our politics for the billionaires. Those 2 false facts were that all of this new spending was going to be independent of political campaigns. That was never tested, never vetted, never litigated. That was a fact that was invented behind the curtains of the Supreme Court by those 5 justices. And history shows since then that had a real fact-finding effort been undertaken, it would have been clear that this spending is not at all independent of political campaigns. But here's where it's indisputable. The court also held, those 5 judges, also held that all of this unlimited billions that they were letting loose into our politics would be transparent, that voters would know who was behind the money. Well, in 2024, $1.9 billion in money was spent in elections that we don't know who's behind. That is a $1.9 billion factual rebuke to the Supreme Court Citizens United decision. It simply isn't true. So that decision hangs on a false fact that was found by a court that shouldn't even be doing fact-finding, and which for 16 years those 5 judges have scrupulously refused to correct, even as the falsity of the fact upon which their decision depended has been proven over and over and over again. I'll close by pointing to the Disclose Act, a bill that can remedy this by requiring contributions over 10 grand into a political race to be disclosed by the actual donor. No more hiding behind a 501c3 that converts to a 501c4 that sends money to a super PAC that spends it in the election. No, you go all the way back to the actual real donor. We should pass that bill. Every time we've brought it up, every Republican has voted to defend dark money, and every Democrat has voted to rid our politics of this corrupting scourge. Every time, every Republican, every Democrat. It is a clear divide, a clear difference between us, and the public is with us. The public is infuriated that big, secretive, special interests can control our politics from behind the scenes with massive dark money contributions. Last point, if you can make an enormous dark money contribution, you can threaten or promise to make an enormous dark money contribution. And those threats and promises will never be seen. It is the core of political corruption to make decisions based on secret threats and promises about massive political spending. We have to get rid of this. The decision was ill-founded, factually wrong, and needs to be corrected. I yield.
Mr. President,
Oregon.
I think my colleague, Senator Whitehouse, who has been pointing out that we have a money and politics system that is corrupting the vision of government by and for the people, and it's replacing it with government by and for the powerful. Who in America wants a governmental system designed and intended to be a reflection of ordinary citizens' desires and aspirations and opinions to simply be a country run by oligarchs, by billionaires? And yet, that is where we have arrived. And we absolutely need to change this campaign system, money in the campaigns, in order to save any possibility of a republic by and for the people. What we really have now are 2 campaign systems, one for ordinary citizens and one for the mega-rich, that gives the mega-rich extraordinary power. Now, if you or I make a donation to a candidate, well, first of all, there's a cap on it of several $1,000s. Now, I know nobody in my blue-collar community donates several $1,000s to a campaign, but there are upper middle-income families that do donate thousands of dollars, but it is thousands, not millions, not tens of millions, and it's completely disclosed. You can look up who gave to the candidate. It's disclosed. It's capped. That's the system for ordinary Americans. But then there's the system for the powerful that every single Republican in this chamber keeps voting to defend. It's called the dark money system. There is no cap on the amount that can be donated. There is no public disclosure to the American people. The Supreme Court created this dual system saying, you know, a cap on money to the candidate, well, that could produce a conflict of interest or an appearance of corruption, so you can cap it. But if you give it to the friend of the candidate to run a parallel campaign, well, that's suddenly whitewashed or washed clean, and there's no influence on the candidate. The candidate probably won't even know about it. Well, everyone knows that is complete fallacy. Complete and totally. Somebody gives $10 million to the friend of the candidate to run a parallel campaign. The candidate knows that that's happening. They see the ads. They hear about the source. Even that parallel campaign, they can still share staff. I mean, there's no real division between them. So that was a completely phony distinction created by the court to create a system of corporate and billionaire power in America. And as my colleague pointed out, in the context of climate, we saw a radical change immediately. Well, the growth in dark money has been stunning. Because there's so much money among the oligarchs and billionaires, they want to spend it to create laws that favor the oligarchs and billionaires. And they are spending at an extraordinary rate. Now, 6 years ago, it was about $300 million. That's a lot of money. But according to the Brennan Center article from May 7th, and I ask unanimous consent to insert this into the record. Thank you. Dark money hit a record high of $1.9 billion in the 2024 races. That's a six-fold increase in 6 years. That's the rich and powerful buying their government. It is an absolute travesty. No one in our founding community of our nation who wrote the Declaration of Independence, who wrote the Constitution, wanted to design a system where the mega rich ran the place as a cabal of elites. But that's what we have. And that's what we have to change. You know, we saw this with President Trump. On April 11th, in 2024, he met with the fossil fuel executives. He had dinner at Mar-a-Lago. His pitch was simple. In exchange for $1 billion, he told them, he promised to prioritize their preferences in the next election. Well, those fossil fuel leaders delivered hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in election spending and lobbying. And what did Trump do? He delivered for them. He gave them $18 billion in new and expanded tax breaks. Pretty good deal, huh? Hundreds of millions of dollars invested, you get $18 billion in tax breaks. And he penalized their competition. The renewable energy that's cheaper and cleaner, he put up all kinds of obstacles to favor dirty, more expensive fossil fuels. He green-lighted LNG terminals. He blocked new solar and wind. He took the United States out of the Paris climate. That's the example of how this money corrupts. So everything we're fighting for the ordinary person is being torched
Going back to your hearing.
by these mega donations. You saw the big, what Trump called his big, beautiful bill. It was really a big, ugly betrayal of American families. It proceeded to cut nutrition. It proceeded to cut health care to deliver, well, trillions of dollars of tax breaks for the richest Americans. And it even ran up the debt, $30 trillion in the next 30 years for those richest Americans. If we're going to change this, we have to change this dynamic. If we fail, we have really failed in our oath to the Constitution. I invite my Republican colleagues, start fighting for a vision of government by and for the people, not by and for the elite, oligarchs, and the billionaires. Let's save our republic. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I'm here today to mark 16 years since the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United, which opened the floodgates to unlimited special interest money in our elections. We had a campaign finance system. It wasn't perfect. It was a bipartisan effort to put some limits on things. And the problem with the way it is now, it opens it up and it is impossible to even trace what money is coming in and where. I want to thank Senator Kelly for bringing us to the floor today to discuss such an important issue for our democracy and my colleagues who are here today. In the 2024 federal election, secret money groups spent $1.9 billion, nearly double the amount spent just one cycle before. This undermines our democracy, shakes the public trust. Unlimited, anonymous federal spending in our elections doesn't encourage free speech. It drowns out the voices of American people who are seeking to participate. I've long supported the constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United and restore the authority of Congress and the states to establish reasonable limits on campaign spending, and I'll keep making the case to build support for that effort. But in the meantime, there are things that we can do to make our campaign finance system stronger and more transparent. That's why I've led the effort, alongside Ranking Member Padilla, to advance common sense bills, including the Freedom to Vote Act, to shine a light on secret money and make sure Americans know who's trying to influence their vote. We came very close to passing my bill. In the last Congress, the Freedom to Vote Act would provide important new tools to rid our politics of big money and root out foreign interference. It includes the Disclose Act, which I have co-sponsored Senator Whitehouse's bill in every Congress since 2012 to end secret money in our politics. The Disclose Act also makes it harder for billionaires and others to hide their contributions by ending the use of transfers between organizations to cloak the identity of donors. And it requires organizations that spend money on political activities to disclose the true owner. The Freedom to Vote Act also includes My Honest Ads Act, the bipartisan legislation I first introduced with Senator John McCain, who we miss very much with his leadership when it comes to campaign finance. This bill would require online platforms to take steps to prevent foreign nationals from buying ads and would ensure that all online platforms disclose the buyers of digital political ads if the platform reaches 50 million or more unique U.S. visitors per month, meaning online platforms would finally have to follow the same rules that TV and radio stations already follow for political acts. It is simply insane that in one medium there are some rules and in another there is not. These changes will increase transparency while including common sense exemptions to protect the First Amendment rights of websites that are simply part of traditional media. Third, the Freedom to Vote Act would strengthen the rules banning coordination between candidates and super PACs to make sure candidates cannot evade contribution limits by working with their super PACs. Finally, the Freedom to Vote Act includes important reforms to the Federal Election Commission to improve the enforcement of our campaign finance laws. And since the Citizens United decision came down 16 years ago, new technologies have emerged that only make the need for reform more pressing. AI videos are making their way into political ads, giving dark money groups a new, cheaper tool to influence politicians and mislead the public. That's why I lead bipartisan bills to ban the use of AI to create deceptive campaign ads. That's a bill that Senator Hawley and I lead, and to require disclaimers on political ads that have content substantially generated by AI. Think about it. If they are blatantly deceptive and are not satire or parody, which is allowed by our Constitution, then they're banned. But otherwise, at least there's a label that says created by AI. That will let the voters know something's up. Maybe this isn't really the politician I love or the politician I don't love. Because whether it's a question of who is funding an ad or whether or not the content of the ad is real, voters deserve transparency. We need to end secret money in our politics to make sure the American people know that their elected officials work for them, not the wealthy and the powerful few, to make sure we have a government that works for everyone. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I rise today with such deep concern about the state of our democracy. Why have we let the scourge of money in our politics get this bad? Why have we ignored the vast majority of Americans who want us to get it under control? Why have we ceded our democracy to the highest bidders? I'm not alone in feeling exasperated, in feeling frustrated, in being angry. As we look back at 16 years in the wake of the Citizens United decision, we should be honest with ourselves. Our politics was never truly fair. Voters were marginalized or excluded because of the color of their skin. Machines and bosses took advantage of everyday people. The powerful thought they could decide for the rest of us. But we made progress. We took steps forward. So much of it was reversed with one swoop of Citizens United. Now we are awash in money and influence, living through a politics where the new bosses hide behind a Supreme Court decision that allows them to pump unlimited money into elections without the risk of exposure or accountability. It feels overwhelming but to understand how bad the amount of money in politics has gotten, you just have to look at the numbers. According to Open Secrets, during 2008 election cycle, outside spending totaled about $574 million. 2 years later, the Citizens United decision came down. Just 2 years after that, during the next presidential election cycle, outside spending topped off at nearly $1.3 billion. And just 2 years ago, in 2024, it came close to $4.5 billion. Those numbers are disgusting. The American people are sick and tired of this, being bombarded with ads, but it's not just about that, it's worse. The American people know that they are being purposely manipulated, fed lies. And the amount of money, untraced, unaccountable, undemocratic money, is beyond comprehension. But to me, what's even more unbelievable is that it's insanely unpopular. Last year, the group Issue 1 conducted a poll of the 15th anniversary of the Citizens United decision. Nearly 80% said that unchecked spending gives rise to corruption. More than 75% said that the amount of money in politics was causing them to lose faith in democracy itself. 77% said that when we tackle big money in our politics, we make our democracy stronger. These numbers are across the political spectrum. And these numbers are borne out in survey after survey. Pew just in 2023 showed that nearly 3/4 of all Americans just want us to put limits on what can be spent. Mr. President, we live in the time of the greatest amount of distrust in our government in modern American history. Now, I decided to run for office nearly a decade ago because I saw what Citizens United did and the unchecked money in our politics was impacting. It was one of the first things I talked about on the campaign trail. It was one of the first things I pushed to introduce and spoke out about on the House floor. And every year, we've carried the fight forward to reverse it. Now, it's important for us to remember not to feel helpless. I've often said that the opposite of democracy is apathy. And too often we say that money in politics, this is a problem too big. We can't solve it. or the challenges are too entrenched, we're not going to be able to mobilize to fix it. But I just urge us on this anniversary of Citizens United to keep in mind that it doesn't have to be this way. We don't need to have a politics that is exasperating. We can have one that is empowering. We can have one where the voices of voters, not the endless bank accounts of the well-off and the well-connected, decide who represents us. And we can have a politics that restores and grows trust rather than actively degrading it. This year is the 250th anniversary of the independence of our nation. And we will be referencing that a lot in this chamber because this is our moment to free Americans from the influence of big money, to give them back their voice in a democracy. Let us come together and get it done. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The senator from New Jersey.
I want to thank Senator Merkley, for bringing people to the floor to talk about which is unequivocally the greatest threat to American democracy right now. It is the cancer that is metastasizing more and more and more. Since the Citizens United decision, I have watched how this body has seen clearly corrupt forces beginning to overrun the common sense and the will of the people, and policy more and more be bent to the whim and the will of the wealthiest of the wealthy in our country and in the world, as well as corporations, many of them multinational corporations. We are in crisis. Our nation is in crisis as more and more Americans lose trust, lose faith in our country, in our democracy, that the people that serve, the 535 members, the 100 members of the Senate, the 435 members of the House of Representatives, they feel more and more they are in it for themselves and corporations and not to do the hard work of the people. Trust is vital for a democracy to thrive. And there has been nothing more powerful in undermining that trust in the years I've been in the Senate that I've seen than the destructive force of money in our politics. We know that the decision that was made by a conservative majority of 5 justices, 3 of whom are still on the court, permitted those billionaires and corporations to pour unlimited, unchecked money into our elections, drowning out the collective voices of the people. Let me give you an example. Sobering fact. In 2024, about 44% of all the money raised to support Donald Trump came from 10 individual donors. Think about that for a second. Of the billions of dollars that were spent on this election, for the President of the United States right now, 44% of that money was contributed by 10 people. This is not just a purview of any party, though. This is something that is infecting our entire system. And people ask the question rightfully, what does all that influence and money buy? Well, right now we're seeing it. Individuals like Elon Musk and other billionaires are exercising an outsized influence on our party, threatening people in this body and other body to drop millions and millions of dollars against them. And to say that doesn't have an influence is wrong. Unlimited corporate cash literally buys policies that put even more money in the pockets of the wealthiest, allows them to rig the system to benefit them, while working class Americans more and more get a raw deal. We are seeing a virtual welfare state for the wealthiest of the wealthy in our policies that benefits and protects the wealthiest, that serves the largest corporations, that's designed to line the pockets further and further of the wealthy. It is a tax cut for corporations that we've seen in policies, while Americans and their most important issues, whether it's their health care, whether it is their ability to make a living, is further and further undermined. Citizens United has created a system where presidential pardons are pay to play, where environmental regulations that keep us safe and healthy are slashed, where corporate mergers are rubber stamped by federal regulators. 16 years now, we have seen the slow, cancerous corruption of American democracy. We've seen how folks who pay the price get outsized influence, that a small group of billionaires and corporations wield enormous power over elections and in turn over the policies that all Americans have to live under. And this has fueled what is growing to be a growing deep discontent. Ending Citizens United is wildly popular on both sides of the aisle. The majority of Americans want to see an end to this cancerous decision. Americans are sick and tired, and they're demanding that we act. I believe this body should come together in a bipartisan way to end the nightmare that has been unleashed on America by Citizens United. I know from private conversations with people on both sides of the aisle that it would be a relief not to have this outsized influence of money and power on this body. It would allow us to focus in an undeterred way on the business of the people. I'm proud to co-sponsor bills that would end this nightmare, like Democracy for All, the amendment to overturn this misguided decision. I'm proud to champion common sense reforms like the Freedom to Vote Act and, God, the Disclose Act, which just would ensure that the dark money pouring into our elections, the cancerous resources unleashed by the wealthiest of the wealthy, at least they could not pour that money in and then hide their identity. It would shine light on what is a dark, dark process. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, but particularly my Republican colleagues, to listen to the overwhelming majority of Americans who just not only want to avoid the dark, cancerous reality that Citizens United has brought to us, but are hoping and yearning for our democracy to get back to the ideals that we all share, that we pledge allegiance to, that could make this 250th anniversary of our country something truly to celebrate, that we are a nation free from this cancer, free from the dark money that's flooding our politics, that indeed we are free at last to see what can happen in an America that focuses on the people, the power of the people, and not just the power of the wealthiest. I yield the floor.
Democratic Whip.
Mr. President, I want to thank Senator Merkley for bringing us together on the floor to talk about Citizens United. Senator Kelly has the honor of representing the state of Arizona. When I was a member of the House of Representatives, I served with a congressman from Arizona named Morris Udall. He was a great guy, ran for president. He was the source of more jokes and comedy than any politician of his day. And he used to say, if you have politics in your bloodstream, only embalming fluid will replace it. I'm living proof that he was right. In 1982, I decided to run for the U.S. House of Representatives for the first time. This was after I lost 3 straight elections. My wife said this was my last chance. So I took on an incumbent in 1982 for the U.S. House of Representatives. He'd been in that seat for 22 years. But because of the quirky law in Illinois, the Democrats got to draw the map. So I got a map against the Republican incumbent, which is 40% new territory. I had a chance. And 82 was a big year for Democrats. I remember it. I still remember my fear. Would I raise enough money to be a viable candidate? Nobody knew for sure. The average cost of a congressional campaign in 1982 was $215,000 for a campaign to run for the U.S. House. I raised and spent, as did my opponent, $800,000 each. We set records, $800,000. If you say that today, would you start off and wage a campaign for the House with $800,000? You'd say, Well, that's just for the announcement, right? You're going to need a few more dollars if you're serious about being a candidate. The number has grown dramatically and now is in the millions for candidates for the House and for the Senate. You're looking at the last open public sponsor of public financing of campaigns. Nobody else has tackled it since I stopped introducing it. By the time I introduced it, Arlen Specter of Pennsylvania, a Republican, was my co-sponsor. We had a bipartisan bill. I still believe it's the right way to go, but it doesn't have a chance. Under the current system, as has been described by my colleagues here on the floor, there's so much entrenched money that they virtually control the agenda and scare the living hell out of average individuals who don't have a fortune to spend. And that's the reality of what we face. Senator Booker is a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. It's an interesting world we live in. There is a group, I won't name their names on the floor, but it'd be easy to figure out who I'm talking about, that admonishes me regularly as the chairman and ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I'm just not progressive enough. I'm not doing enough. This group, this influence group here in Washington, is a dark money operation. We don't know where their money's coming from. They're the reformers, this dark money operation. We now have currently a debate going on the floor about cryptocurrency. Remember what happened in the last campaign on cryptocurrency? The industry decided that they would pick out one or two Democrats and make a point that they were in the wrong position when it came to cryptocurrency. And so they spent $40 million to defeat one of our colleagues here in the Senate, and they succeeded. That's the kind of thing that happens now, $40 million. You know, that's more than a good day raising money for most candidates, but that's the reality of what we face. This decision that we face today, the Citizens United, was mindless. To say that a business has the same rights as individuals under the Constitution is a mindless conclusion. And it's no surprise, if I'm not mistaken, I'll double check, if I'm not mistaken, not a single Supreme Court justice who ruled in that case had ever stood for office, ever had a fundraiser, ever had to go through it and understand what it does to you. I think ethical reform that's meaningful requires a scandal that is earth-shattering. I'm not sure what's left by way of scandal. What's going on with corruption in this business has become almost routine. And I'm sorry to say that because so many people on both sides of the aisle are good, honest people who are public servants trying to do their best. But this Citizens United decision and where we are in politics today has changed this business so much, I'm not sure we can ever reclaim the kind of idealism that we all aspire to be public servants in this institution. I thank you for drawing us to the floor today. There's a lot of work to be done. I may not be around for some of it, but I'll still remember that $800,000 when I first ran was a record. Now it's rather routine. Let's make sure that if you have politics in your bloodstream, it doesn't take embalming fluid to replace it. Let's replace it with the ideals that we all aspire to. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank Senator Kelly for bringing us down to the floor today. Hard to believe it's been 16 years since our politics were upended, since the floodgates were opened to corporate money in an unlimited way, in an anonymous way, coming into our elections. Senator Durbin, of course, has been a hero, as he mentioned, spending much of his career trying to introduce legislation, pass legislation that would put citizens in charge of our elections rather than big money. So let's just a few minutes here, because I know there's others that want to speak. I just want to make maybe 3 points. The first is to just give you the scope, if we haven't put this information on the record already, as to how things have changed. Senator Durbin was doing some of this already in referencing how little elections used to cost compared to how much they cost today. But let's just talk about, the full amount of money that's in politics today as compared to, let's say, 1976, a few years before Senator Durbin was first running for Congress. In 76, total federal election spending by candidates and committees was $160 million. In the last election in 2024, candidates and committees together spent $15.9 billion. Okay, now, it's a long time between 76 and 2024, so let's adjust that for inflation. Adjusted for inflation, it's still 100 times more money. That is stunning. That is stunning in and of itself. But here's what makes it corrupt. What makes it corrupt is that prior to the Citizens United decision, outside groups, non-candidate groups, were spending about $144 million in elections annually. In 2024, outside groups spent $4.2 billion. When Senator Durbin was first running, he was raising money from individuals, folks that were spending $25, $100, maybe a couple $100 on campaign contributions. Individuals today make up just 16% of total spending in elections. 16%, 84% of all the spending in elections today are not done by citizens. 84% of spending are corporations and organizations. Most of that money, maybe not most, much of that money is anonymous. You have no idea where it comes from. And so let me tell you what the impact of that is. The impact of that is corruption. Let's just call it what it is. When a handful of billionaires and corporations have that much influence on our elections, and unaccountable influence, you have no idea who's spending all of that money, who's throwing these ads on TV that are being produced by PACs with innocuous sounding names like Save Our Future, Build Our Future, This Is Our Future. The impact of that is it's corrupt. It's corrupt. There's a group that's being formed right now called Leading the Future, another one of these innocuous sounding PACs. It's promising to spend $100 million in the election this fall. And it is being funded by a group of AI companies, companies that are trying to get the Congress to pass legislation to essentially give these AI companies a free ride. No protection from deep fakes, no protection from the poison they're feeding our children. They want free reign. And so they're putting up $100 million in this next election. I just did the math sitting at my desk quickly. The average individual contribution today is about $25. That's a lot of money for some people to give $25 to an election. If every single resident of my state, every single resident gave $25, that wouldn't equal the $100 million commitment that one super PAC has made to this next election. That's stunning. That shows you how much power a handful of these companies have. And the only way that this group Leading Our Future can put $100 million into this next election to try to stop Congress from regulating artificial intelligence is because of the Citizens United decision. Because that decision allows those companies that are swimming in money right now to be able to write an unlimited check into this next election. And so you can understand why people feel powerless today, why people feel like this whole system is rigged. Because even if they give $25, it just doesn't make a difference when a handful of companies can, with the snap of their fingers, muster $100 million to try to change the impact of an election on public policy. The last point I want to make is this. This fight that we're having now, in which only Democrats care about changing our campaign finance laws, in which Republicans, almost to a person, have no interest in trying to decrease the influence of corporations and billionaires in our elections, it's ahistorical. In fact, this has not historically been a particularly partisan issue, except for the last 25 years. There's a giant cult-like poster of Donald Trump on the Department of Labor that I drive by every day in and out of the Capitol. It's super creepy. The idea that we have Mao and Stalin-like banners of the President of the United States surrounding the United States Capitol. But next to the banner of Donald Trump on the Department of Labor building is a banner depicting the image of Teddy Roosevelt. And I guess it's an attempt by the president to draw an equivalency between himself and Teddy Roosevelt. That's a that's a stretch. But Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican who, in the wake of a pretty minor scandal in 1904, when a couple companies sent secret checks to his campaign and to other Republican campaigns, came to Congress and said, we got to ban corporate money from elections. He had trouble getting Republicans to do it at first, so he reached out across the aisle and worked with a particularly vile Democrat, a guy by the name of Benjamin Pitchfork Tillman, just a bad guy. Actually, our Rule 19, which we use against each other occasionally to try to settle the tone of debate, it's in our rules because of Benjamin Pitchfork Tillman. Anyway, Roosevelt, a Republican, Tillman, a Democrat, got together and said, let's ban corporations from being able to influence our elections. That's the Tillman Act that was the law of the land in practice until the Citizens United decision. For 100 years until that decision, Republicans and Democrats actually worked together pretty well to say, you know what, the people should be in charge, not corporations. That wasn't a partisan idea. It is now, unfortunately. And so I'm grateful to Senator Kelly for bringing us down to the floor to talk about the way that our citizens feel like they don't have power, the way that the Citizens United decision has left our voters feeling like the game is rigged. But it is kind of sad that it is only Democrats down here talking about the impact that that decision has had on the influence of corporations and billionaires in our politics. For a long time, Republicans cared about trying to make sure that our democracy was fair. That's not the case any longer. Thank you, Senator Kelly, for allowing us to come down and have this discussion.
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
we are here on the floor of the Senate today to discuss the War Powers Resolution, to discuss the recent war activities in Venezuela. And yet there still is a debate. Some say there's not a war. Some say there is a war. Some say we won't know for a while if there is a war or isn't a war. Last year we had this debate. The junior senator from Texas came forward and he presented a War Powers Resolution for Gaza. He said that President Biden's decision to send U.S. troops in to build a beachhead, to build a pier, was sending them into a war zone. Interestingly, every Republican senator at that time voted for a point of order or against a point of order, and the point of order said no hostilities exist. The point of order at the time said Gaza is not a war. And every Republican voted against that point of order because every Republican considered that Gaza was a war zone and that the War Powers Resolution applied. Fast forward to today, the proposition that the majority of Republicans will put forward is a point of order saying there isn't a war in Venezuela. So they all believed that there was a war in Gaza, but they all now believe that there's not a war in Venezuela. Now, there are arguments, I think, actually for both being war. In Gaza, the troops that were building the beachhead were fired on multiple times. So I would think U.S. troops under fire sounds a bit like you're putting them into a war. Now we have a situation in Venezuela where hundreds of troops were sent in, dozens and dozens of pilots and planes were sent in. You bombed a nation's capital. You had extraordinary rendition of the nation's president. And now we have a blockade involving hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors. But that's not a war. So So it's somewhat boggling to the mind that almost every Republican senator believed there was a war when a few soldiers were shot at in Gaza trying to build a pier. I agreed with them. I think that was putting U.S. troops into war. But now every Republican, not every Republican, virtually all the Republican senators who believed that it was a war in Gaza now believe it's not a war in Venezuela. Now, some of them on the quiet will tell you, well, it was a war, but it's all over. It's all done. Yeah, we're not going to quibble. We really weren't arresting somebody. It wasn't a drug arrest. It was a war. It was a mini war, but it's all over. So the War Powers Resolution doesn't apply because the war is over. And yet, we still have an entire military blockade of a country, and that's not a war. This is a real question. So we have been given a legal opinion by the current administration, and we had one of their assistant attorney generals come in and explain to us why this is not a war. And you have to realize this is an important part of the debate, because if it is a drug bust, it's not a war. So they've told us this is really just a drug bust. We had to bomb the entire Capitol. We had to remove all their air defense. We have an armada of 20,000 ships and hundreds of airplanes flown from all over the world, but it really was just a drug arrest. It really isn't a war. But this young man came into us and he explained to us that we probably don't know yet whether it's a war. And the way we will know it's a war is by the scope, the extent, and the duration, including how many people die in the war. So the problem we have, though, is the Constitution gives us the power to initiate war, to declare war. But if we don't know if it's a war until after all the people die, and we add up how many people die, and then they call it a constitutional war because a lot of people died, wouldn't it then be a little bit late to vote on initiating the war? See, this is an enormous debate. This is an important debate, and this should not be sloughed over as, oh, no big deal, the war's already over. Well, we actually don't even know if the war's already over. We are under a blockade. The current administration has said they will send troops back in if they need to. They've said they'll send troops into other countries if they need to. The blockade is said to be, oh, we're going to control the ships and we're going to sell the oil and then we're going to run. We're in charge. It's our oil. We're going to be in charge of Venezuela. But that sounds to me like a military blockade, a long-term military blockade, and I don't know how we argue that that's not war. But the position of the administration, and probably the position of other presidential administrations, because this isn't really and shouldn't be Republican versus Democrat. This should be legislative prerogative versus presidential prerogative, and it should be about the Constitution. The Constitution specifically, thoughtfully vested the power of initiating war and declaring war to Congress. They talked about it. They talked about it in the Constitutional Convention. They wrote about it in the Federalist Papers. And from Hamilton to Jefferson, the spectrum of our founding fathers concluded they didn't want the president to have this power. They said the initiation, the declaration of war shall be vested by the Constitution in the legislature. So what we have is an elaborate song and dance. They know that declaration of war resides here. They know initiation of war, so they argue first that it's not war, it's a drug bust. But then they say, well, internationally, people say it probably is a war. So in case you think it's a war, we're going to tell you that it's not really a war because we won't know if it's a war till it's over. We don't know, we'll tell you more about, we'll know when the war is over whether it actually was a war and whether we should have voted to initiate war when the war is over, depending on how many people die. And then they say, well, we're going to look at the scope, extent, and duration of the war, but since we don't know what that is, we're going to guess based on what the policymakers say. And they say that right now they're not going back in, so we don't have to vote on whether or not we're going to war with Venezuela. This to me is an absurdity. It is logic that runs in circles, and it doesn't get us any closer to where we need to be. The reason the Founding Fathers gave this power to the legislature is because they wanted to make war less frequent. They wanted to make war hard to initiate. They wanted to see war more as a defensive notion, not as an offensive enterprise. During the debate over whether Gaza was a war, the resolution was introduced by the junior senator from Texas, and virtually every Republican voted for it. Interestingly, Marco Rubio voted for it. The Secretary of State actually voted to say that the war in Gaza, where troops were being shot at that were building a pier, was a war. But now things seem to have reversed, and all of those who thought Gaza was a war, where there were some shots being fired at the people trying to build a pier, which would, by many people's interpretation, be a lot less than an entire invasion of a capital and the removal of a president and a blockade of an entire country. Every Republican in this body, including the current Secretary of State, voted that Gaza was a war. In making the arguments that Gaza was a war, the junior senator from Texas expressed the reality that the Senate had abdicated its constitutional responsibility. So at that time, the junior senator from Texas argued that Gaza was a war. He said, "Over recent decades, we have seen the Senate hand away much of our responsibility on foreign policy and national security to the executives. That is contrary to the design of our Constitution, and it is frankly harmful to the Senate and harmful to this country." I couldn't agree more. But I don't understand how it was harmful when we were talking about Gaza, and it's no longer harmful when we're talking about arguably a much greater military incursion into a country. It seems as if, and I know this would be shocking to people, that there's some partisanship here, that there's a different definition of war under Democrats than there is under Republicans. My colleague from Texas went on to highlight the flagrant hypocrisy of both parties, saying on the Senate floor, far too often, the Senate has stepped out of our historic role in foreign policy and said, whatever the president wants, we, the Senate, aren't going to say anything about it. When there is a Republican president, Democrats suddenly discover their voice and say, hey, the Senate ought to say something. But when it's a Democrat president, it seems no matter how incoherent and disastrous the foreign policy from the Democrat president, the Democrat senators don't want the Senate to exercise its authority. I would argue today is evidence that both sides are guilty of this. I would argue that if Gaza was a war, the bombing of the Venezuelan capital and the removal of the president and the blockade of an entire country might qualify as a war. If a few soldiers shooting at our soldiers who are trying to build a temporary pier or a temporary port in Gaza is war, which every Republican in the body voted for, certainly they must think that invasion of a capital is a war, that removing a president is war, or that blockade of a country. So even though the first incursion, the first invasion may well be over, is the blockade of a country not a war? Are we not at war when we have a military blockade of a country? The American people are sick and tired of their elected officials disregarding the Constitution when their party is in power and then becoming ardent defenders of the Constitution when the opposing party is in power. Each of us took an oath to the Constitution to defend it. That applies at all times, not just when it's politically convenient. Congress maintains a constitutional duty to debate matters of war. Playing politics when the lives of our brave service members are on the line and our country is at risk of being entangled in yet another foreign conflict is an inexcusable dereliction of duty. At this point, I think we need to have a fulsome debate, a debate in our country, a debate in the Senate over what war is. But I think anyone who accepts the ludicrous notion that they will tell you what war is after the war is over should not be treated seriously. How can we do our duty? How can we do our duty to initiate and declare war if we don't know what war is until it's over? If after the war we can count the casualties and there were a significant amount of casualties, or the incursion took a significant amount of time, then there is war. Or some will say, well, we can just defund the war. Well, you know what? It's never happened. Find me the senator or congressman who wants to vote against money for our troops who are being shot at. It is very difficult to stop funding a war once we start because a nation's patriotism rises up naturally. The time to start a war is before it gets started. But if they're telling you they define war by how many casualties there are, you got to wait till the war is over to determine whether it was a war, to determine whether we should initiate the war. This is an absurdity. Both parties, really frankly, have been guilty of hypocrisy on this. But the order today that we will be voting on is whether or not the point of order says that this is not a war. Well, invasion of another country, blockading of a country, and removing another country's leader, to my mind, clearly is war, and I will vote against this point of order.
Senator from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. President. To my colleagues, last week the Senate agreed to discharge our bipartisan war powers resolution from the Foreign Relations Committee so that we could finally, after months, debate military action against Venezuela and Venezuelans on the floor of the Senate, and not just allow the administration to wage combat on its own with no information shared except in classified settings. I thank my colleagues, two of whom are here on the floor today, who voted for this resolution. They did not vote to rebuke a president, although for some reason he's chosen to see it that way. Instead, they voted to uphold a basic constitutional principle that we should not be waging offensive hostilities without a debate and vote in Congress. As I described last week, the reason for that principle is clear. Don't send our sons and daughters into military hostilities without the debate and vote in Congress that would put the thumbprint of the nation's leadership on the validity of the mission. I believed that today we were going to have a debate about the War Powers Resolution, possibly consider amendments to it, and then hold a vote on final passage. But I now learn that some want to foreclose the possibility of a debate and allow the president to carry out this unauthorized campaign with no public debate and no vote. And they are apparently preparing a parliamentary move to deprive our resolution of the privileged status given it under the War Powers Resolution and thus shut debate down. First, an effort to declare this resolution not privileged, apparently by arguing that the campaign in and against Venezuelans is not hostilities, is something that the House has actually been doing, but the Senate should not emulate. Some of you remember that the Senate has passed a number of resolutions against President Trump's unilateral tariff taxes that are privileged. They're also privileged, or they used to be in the House, but the House was so afraid to even have a debate or vote about this matter that they used a procedural parliamentary trick to turn off the privilege. I don't think that is worthy of emulation by the greatest deliberative body in the world. We shouldn't be afraid to debate and discuss anything, especially matters of war and peace. Second, an argument that the Venezuela campaign is not imminent hostilities within the meaning of the War Powers Resolution is a violation of every reasonable meaning of that term. Let's begin with a boat campaign against boats with Venezuelans on it starting on September 2nd that have now killed more than 100 designated combatants. The amassing of U.S. military assets that the president calls an armada in and around Venezuela. The president's authorization of covert action in Venezuela. The United States military's use in the interdiction of oil from Venezuela. The attack over 2 weekends ago to seize the Venezuelan president, President Maduro, and his wife, where more than 100 combatants were killed, where U.S. troops were injured, and now ongoing control facilitated by the United States military. The United States is determining who can govern Venezuela. We've tapped the vice president of Venezuela and determined that she is somebody who should be the leader rather than the opposition who won an overwhelming election just a year ago. We have said we can determine when Venezuela will finally be entitled to have its own elections, saying that they're not going to be ready for that for some long period of time. We're seizing the nation's primary economic asset, its oil. We are deciding how the oil revenues, every penny of the oil revenues of this nation, should be spent, and President Trump is even saying that he gets to determine which United States companies can even invest in the Venezuelan oil economy. And it's all being done with the active participation of the United States military. The U.S. military assets in place around Venezuela are, as President Trump said, an armada. 16,000 U.S. personnel, this is open source reporting as of 2 days ago, arrayed around Venezuela. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, Carrier Air Wing 9, the USS Winston Churchill, the USS Bainbridge, and the USS Mahan. The Iwo Jima Amphibious Readiness Group, which includes the USS Fort Lauderdale, the USS San Antonio, and the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit. The USS Thomas Hudner, DDG-116, the USS Stockdale, DDG-106, the USS Lake Erie, CG-70, the USS Gettysburg, CG-64, the USS Wichita, LCS-13, the USNS Waters, the USNS Joseph Humphreys, and the USNS Kanawha. And that's in addition to air assets that are arrayed all around the region that have been used and are likely to be used in the future. Everything that's being done to control Venezuela, its politics, and its economy are being facilitated by the United States military. But it's more than assets in place. Operation Southern Spear, the boat strikes of Venezuelan boats in international waters, is still being carried out by the United States military. The United States military is engaged in a naval blockade of Venezuela, transit out and transit in. Would we think that was an act of war if Russia was blockading the United States and not allowing commerce to come into or out of our ports? The U.S. military is engaged in active interdiction of Venezuelan oil in the Pacific and the Caribbean and elsewhere in the world, and the United States is threatening future military action. President Trump said about the Vice President Rodriguez, if she didn't act well, she would have a fate worse than President Maduro. President Trump was going to do a second invasion last Friday that he called off after our vote Thursday afternoon, threats of future invasion. If this is not imminent hostilities, with the death now of more than 200 combatants, with U.S. troops injured, with an armada arrayed around, and a naval interdiction of oil and a blockade of this country's economy, it would violate every reasonable meaning of this term, and to pretend otherwise would weaken the respect that this institution should aspire to. Finally, Mr. President, to my colleagues, there's been some recent correspondence between the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Schiff of Idaho, and the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, that basically underline my point. Some Senate colleagues wanted to use this procedural maneuver today, and they felt that it would help if they could have a clear definition or description from the administration that the military operation is over. And so, Mr. President, I have the letter here that Senator Schiff wrote to the President of the United States yesterday, and he asked two simple questions. First, provide Congress with an official correspondence confirming that Operation Absolute Resolve has ended. First request. And second, specify that, quote, U.S. military personnel are no longer involved in hostilities in Venezuela. Two simple questions. I don't know that those questions would have been sufficient for me, but apparently Senator Schiff thought if he could get yes answers to both of those questions, it would be sufficient for him. Senator Rubio sent a response today and would not answer yes to either of the questions. The letter from Senator Rubio, dated earlier today, January 14, very explicitly does not say that Operation Absolute Resolve is over. He was asked to say it had ended. He would not say that it's ended. How could it be ended when the president is still threatening other sanctioned and indicted Venezuelan officials with a fate worse than Maduro's if they don't meet the U.S. standards? So in this letter, which my colleagues sought to justify their vote on this parliamentary maneuver that's coming up, Senator Rubio would not specify that the absolute resolve is ended. Well, how about the second question? Please specify that U.S. military personnel are no longer involved in hostilities in Venezuela. Secretary Rubio would not say that either. I quote, "There are currently no U.S. armed forces in Venezuela." He didn't say U.S. forces aren't involved in hostilities in or against Venezuelans, because he couldn't say that with the interdiction, with the blockade, with the boat strikes. And so even the effort of my colleagues to try to find a parliamentary escape hatch, oh, there's no hostilities, and a softball set of 2 questions to the Secretary of State to justify their position produced a response where he would not agree that the operation is over, the military operation, and he would not agree that the U.S. is now not in hostilities in or against Venezuela. This is the 3rd vote we've had on Venezuela in the last 3 months. Only now does the administration and its supporters make the claim that there are no hostilities. They didn't make that claim in the first 2 months as the Armada was amassing, as we were killing people on open waters, as we were committing to covert action, as we were preparing and practicing for an invasion. They knew that it was hostilities, and that's why they didn't challenge it. But only now, on the 3rd vote, are they challenging whether this is or is not hostilities. And they're doing so to avoid public debate. That's the reason they're doing this. If this cause and if this legal basis were so righteous and so lawful, the administration and its supporters would not be so afraid to have this debate before the public in the United States Senate. For that reason, I urge my colleagues to avoid a parliamentary gag rule on discussion of this military operation and support the bipartisan War Powers Resolution. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from California.
Mr. President, this year our nation will celebrate its 250th birthday. 250 years in which our country has built on the foundation that is our Constitution. The framers could not conceive of exactly what the future would bring, but they did anticipate a great deal, in significant part because they could count on some of the immutable characteristics of human nature, of institutions, of communities, like the attraction of the accumulation of power, and how, unless that gravitational force is counterbalanced, one institution or one man can come to dominate the life of a country. One power in particular concerned our founders, and that was the power to make war. They had seen and been the victims of a monarch who had used the power of war against them, and so they made the radical decision, so contrary to all the precedent at the time, not to invest such a vital attribute of state sovereignty in the executive, but to grant the power to declare war to Congress. In April 1798, a future President James Madison wrote to another future President Thomas Jefferson, underscoring the danger and the decision. He said, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates is that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature." Most prone to it. Words written more than 200 years ago and so fitting for today, when in but his first year in office, the president has used military power in Iran, Nigeria, Syria, Yemen, and most significantly in Venezuela. After months of escalating military action against boats in the southern Caribbean After amassing a massive military armada on the doorstep of a foreign nation, the administration dispatched American service members to invade and arrest the corrupt leader of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. Military action that we were repeatedly told would never come to pass by a president who promised to avoid starting new foreign wars, engaging in nation building, or conducting regime change operations. This operation was not about narcotics, nor was it about democracy. It was about oil. The military occupation in Venezuela captured the country's corrupt dictator, but has left the corrupt drug-running regime in place instead of turning over the reins of governance to that country's legitimately elected leadership of Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez. And now our president has committed to running Venezuela for years in order to exploit its oil resources. Today we have the opportunity to exercise the power bestowed on us by our framers to authorize the use of force or to decline to do so, but to reassert some constraint on an executive grown too fond of the use of military power. We took the first step last week when a bipartisan majority of this body voted to set before the Senate a war powers resolution on Venezuela. That was a strong bipartisan signal that this chamber was unwilling to let the war powers of this body atrophy to the point where they are no more substantial than air. Now we're on the precipice of that debate, whether we should again risk the lives of our service members to procure access to another nation's oil, and the American people should see us weighing that cost. The president has threatened the possibility of additional strikes in Venezuela if Venezuela does not, quote, behave. And by behave, I think we have to acknowledge that the behavior the president expects is for that country to share access to its oil wealth with American oil companies. Now, many of those companies are dubious about investing in Venezuela. Some believe it would take years or more than a decade to make that profitable. Whether it makes good business sense to them is their decision. But whether we use the military might of the United States of America to safeguard their investment is our decision. And I say it is not worth risking the lives of our troops. There are some deeply important questions as to the use of American military power that are implicated in this debate, questions that deserve answers. Will we see years of American gunships parked off of Venezuela as part of some new amorphous Don Road doctrine? How do we expect to run another country of more than 20 million people? Will U.S. forces be used to protect oil infrastructure in Venezuela? Will our president continue to stand by the illegitimate regime that Maduro's capture has left in place? Or will we support the outcome of the last election in which Maduro's opposition was triumphant? Are we better off spending the nation's time, our nation's time and taxes on Venezuela, or should we spend them at home to bring down costs and address the affordability crisis? Our service members and their families deserve answers to these questions before we ask any service member to put their lives on the line. Let us make sure they get those answers. Let us have this debate. Let us move beyond a parliamentary point of order designed to hide from the American people the cost of our military involvement in Venezuela, the continuing cost of it. Let's have the fulsome debate that deserves, because at the center of this debate is a question of whether we want to risk our service members' lives in order to secure the oil resources of another country. I do not believe it is worth doing so, but let those who believe that it is worth the risk, the danger to our service members and their families, let them come to the Senate floor and make that argument. Let us have this debate. Let's not hide behind some parliamentary maneuver to even avoid a conversation here. There hasn't been a single hearing in committee, open hearing on this subject, not a fulsome debate over the use of our military power. Let us do so now. Mr. President, I yield back.
I recognize the Democrat leader.
Mr. President, the need for this resolution is simple. It is clear. The American people do not support another forever war with Venezuela. The American people don't want Donald Trump sending our troops into harm's way without so much as a debate in Congress. Today, the Senate has a chance to move forward on asserting Congress's constitutional authority on matters of war and peace. We can tell Donald Trump, enough with foreign adventures. It is time to focus on lowering costs here at home. That's what the American people want. This resolution is necessary right now because Donald Trump has made clear what happened in Venezuela is not a one-and-done operation, not at all. Last week, the New York Times asked him, are we going to be there a month, 6 months, a year? And you know what his answer was? Donald Trump said, I would say much longer. He said, we want to give money to Venezuela. Here we are. People don't have enough money for health care, for housing, for so many other things. And we want to give money to Venezuela? How is that America first? And Trump threatened further military action if the current government doesn't cooperate with the United States. Now, the administration is trying to concoct an argument that we're not engaged in hostilities, but that's absurd. Anyone, you don't have to be a great expert on military affairs to know that we are heavily engaged. Donald Trump says we're not engaged in hostilities. Tell that to the 16,000 U.S. service members currently deployed in the Caribbean. Tell that to our service members on the Force Carrier Strike Force. Look at the Marine Expeditionary Unit operating in the region. Donald Trump is turning the Caribbean into a dangerous powder keg, and Congress must rein him in before one mistake ignites a larger, more unstable conflict. So the Senate needs to exert its constitutional role when it comes to the use of military force. I know that there are Senate Republicans acting in good faith who are worried about Venezuela getting out of hand. I urge them to reject this point of order, to provide a necessary backstop, a necessary check, a necessary guardrail on executive power. It's the right thing to do for the American people. That means no more forever wars, no more military escapades without congressional authorization, no more tens of billions to prop up foreign regimes while families, American families, struggle right here at home. I want to thank Senator Kaine. I want to thank Senator Schiff. I want to thank Senator Paul for joining with me in this very necessary resolution. And of course, I thank our great chair of the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee for his good work as well. Yield the floor.